no one can actually say what the woman's going through. You can regulate as much as you want, you can generalize as much as you want, but each woman is an individual woman. Like, women are not just one category that all fit the same mindset.
Well, I've really enjoyed the discussion, and again, thanks very much for letting me take part in this. And I think this is a point that's really missed all the time in debates about abortion, that an individual woman can at a particular point in time know for absolute certain that abortion must be the choice for her. She can be absolutely clear without any shadow of a doubt that to continue a particular pregnancy is 100% not what she wants to do. That same woman at another particular point in her life can value a different pregnancy more than she values her own life. And this happens to women all of the time. You know, women who have abortions also have babies. We need to have a recognition that ultimately that question, when does life matter, what value do we give it when it's fetal life, is something which has to be left up to individuals to decide upon. People can have different opinions on it, they can have different views on it at different particular points in their own life, but we need to then have a system of law and policy which gives as much sway as possible to that variation in views and opinions. But nobody should compel other people to live out this area of life in a way that they don't consider to be appropriate for them.
Hi, I'm Dina. Welcome to WORLDwrite. For this programme, we have asked a group of volunteers to present their views on the conflict in Syria and pose questions to Karl Sharro. Karl Sharro is a commentator and a writer on the Middle East who has kindly agreed to respond to volunteers' views.
Hi, my name's Henna, and the issue I'd like to raise is whether there are any alternatives to the West intervening in Syria. Every day we hear stories of brutalities carried out by Assad's regime, and the rebels appear to be fighting a very one-sided battle. The military outnumber them and are much better equipped with tanks and heavy arms. Western intervention is clearly not the answer because freedom for the Syrians must come from the Syrians themselves. But Karl, are there alternatives to Western intervention that can assist the Syrians in their fight for freedom?
Hannah, I really understand where you're coming from, and I think it's not easy to watch those videos and hear the news about what's happening in Syria and not be moved by it, and to a certain extent have this pressing question, what ought we to do? But again, here in these circumstances, and I always emphasize this when I'm talking about the subject, there's a difference between genuine solidarity and a form of moral superiority that sees ourselves as the savior, and perhaps here in the West, and under the pretense of helping people, we might end up doing more damage than not. There are different forms of alternatives to Western intervention that have been flaunted, including perhaps regional and countries and neighbors of Syria intervening, or the formation of so-called humanitarian corridors. What this ignores is any form of intervention in that form will likely be subject to the desires and the outcomes that those regional players will want. And in the case of things like humanitarian corridors, ideas that sound very good in the abstract, they will certainly involve some form of military intervention, will introduce friction, and will force people to take sides within Syria. And ultimately, having done that, will end up inflaming more the military potential and the violence within Syria itself. So we really need to consider very carefully, why do we have the right to do anything, putting the question of solidarity aside, which are there different avenues for exploring.
Hi, I'm Ahmed Ali and welcome to WORLDwrite. In this Views of the News programme, the issue is racism and football, something which seems to have become a media obsession. We are delighted to have in the studio lecturer and writer on the subject, Stuart WAITON, to respond to some of our questions.
Thank you for inviting me, Ahmed.
I'd like to start by asking my own question. Considering the evolution of the term racism from a society faced with active discrimination, often violent towards its ethnic minorities, to a generation conditioned to be sensitive to any verbal offence deemed racist, with a qualifier such as the word black or Asian, what is your actual definition for the term racism, and would or has any incident in football ever qualified for your definition?
It's a difficult question, Ahmed, but a useful one, I think, to consider what racism is. I tend to think it's much more useful to think about racism as being a force in society, especially when it's encouraged by powerful institutions, by politicians, talking about nationalism, for example, by discriminatory employers, and by police practices. And also by immigration controls that target certain types of people, which they still do as it happens. For example, I was involved in anti-racist politics in the 1980s, and one of the key things that we did was campaign against deportation of people who were described as sort of illegal immigrants and thrown out of the country. Yeah, there wasn't a focus or a fetish on insulting language being shouted by people. It was much more about powerful institutions that were discriminating against black people. Ironically, today in Scotland, where there are few, if any, campaigns now against deportations and immigration controls, but they've now made it illegal for one football team to sing to another football team about going home. So they say, "Home, why don't you go home? The famine is over, why don't you go home?" That has now been depicted as racist. So they can be done for racism, for singing a song, while at the same time people are still being, from certain countries, deported and seen as illegal immigrants.